He knocked 4 times at 8:45 p.m., then walked away as if nothing had happened. He came back the next night, and the night after that? These are real accounts, true stories from people who answered a knock and found their sense of home changed forever. A knock is ordinary. A knock is routine. It's what separates the outside from the inside, the stranger from the family. But when that thin confidence is punctured when someone on the other side of the door insists or returns or circles your house, what begins as an interruption becomes a test. And sometimes the test is a prelude to something far darker. The first voice I want you to hear is from a person in their mid-30s who worked from home on a quiet, dead-end street in suburban America. Their house sat at the end of a quiet lane where streetlights hummed low and delivery trucks were familiar fixtures by day. On a clear evening, at roughly 8:45 p.m., a knock sounded at the front door. It didn't feel like the neighborhood. It felt small, precise. I was on a call, headset on. Everything normal, they told me. The knock was soft. 3 quick ones, like you'd expect from childhood. I pushed my chair away, peered through the peephole. Through the peephole, an ordinary man, mid-30s, maybe older. No vehicle. A small box under his arm. He said he needed a signature. He read a name that didn't belong to anyone in the house. He apologized. He moved on. That should have been the end. It didn't end. The next night, a knock again at the same time. Then, the next night. Each time, the man stood on the small patch of concrete under the porch light and waited. Sometimes, he'd circle, walk a slow loop around the side yard, peer toward the back door. No car anywhere. No delivery van, rumble, nothing to suggest he had stopped by mistake. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that grew more deliberate with each passing evening. The narrator began keeping notes, small, careful observations, the exact times, the direction he walked when he left, the shape of the package. These notes weren't bravado, they were a way to impose order on the uncomfortable pattern forming outside their windows. The house felt watched, like a stage someone was inspecting from the wings. One night, the knock came while the narrator was on a 911 call. They had finally dialed non-emergency police the evening after about a week of visits. They were calm, explaining that a man had been knocking repeatedly and circling the property and that he'd been seen testing doors. The dispatcher listened. Officers were dispatched to check the area. As the narrator whispered into the phone, peering through the blinds, a noise came from the back of the house. A scraping sound. A pressure at a lock. The back door handle yielded with a small metallic cough. He was testing the back door, the narrator recalled, voice low. He put his shoulder into it. Once. Twice. On the other end of the line, officers reported arriving to find pry marks where the frame met the door, a subtle gap, and a telltale blackened groove from a tool that had been forced between wood and jamb. The police photographed the damage. They searched the area. Later, they arrested a man at another residence, a different house, where his attempt had been more visible. That man, the narrator was told, confessed to a method. Knock first, test, return. If nobody answered, move on, and try again somewhere else. He had been, the police suggested, running a series of test small intrusions to gauge occupancy. It's the cold arithmetic of the tactic that chills under the skin. Not all intruders smash windows or force open doors in grand theatrics. Some try a light touch. A knock is a question. If the question goes unanswered, they assume it's safe to pry. After that, the narrator's evenings became a series of tiny decisions that piled into exhaustion. They installed motion sensor lights. They began leaving curtains closed all day. Strangers at the door weren't just strangers. They were possible probes, assessments, rehearsals for a later crime. Months later, the narrator moved to another house. Not because they feared an immediate return, because the house itself felt altered. Like a scene where something had already happened and couldn't be put back together again. There are smaller, quieter consequences. The choice to pick up the phone before answering the door. The way a porch light now feels like an advertisement for vulnerability rather than a beacon of safety. The guilt that follows every delivery. Should I have opened? Should I have called the police sooner? Those are decisions that become habits. Habits that register the fear and keep it alive. But that was only the beginning. If you want more real encounters like this, hit subscribe and stay with us. The second story comes from the other side of the Atlantic. On a narrow street near Glasgow, that house sat low and lived in, with photos on the mantel and the hum of a family's ordinary noise. The narrator was a teenager, then old enough to notice oddities, young enough that danger felt like an intrusion into a world still patterned by safety. For weeks, there were unexplained knocks at odd hours, at doors and windows. Sometimes the sound was distant, soft enough that the family wondered if it was a prank, the kind of neighborhood mischief that teens might laugh off over breakfast. But the knocks returned again and again, like a staccato pulse testing the house's edges. The family spoke about it in muted tones. Probably kids, someone said. Probably drunk. The house held its breath and returned to routine. It was Christmas night when the knocking turned into something else entirely. It was late, and the lights were low, and most of the household slept. The narrator woke to a faint noise, a knock that sounded like it had come from inside the room, for a moment impossibly close. They rose and followed the sound, the boards of the house creaking underfoot. In the living room, where the family always left milk and biscuits for guests or late-night callers, a man was sitting on the couch as if he belonged there. He was clearly intoxicated, slurred, unsteady, opening a beer as if at home. He had moved through rooms like someone exploring set pieces, unencumbered by doors that should have been locked. He wandered around. The narrator remembered. He opened the fridge like he was looking for something. He shouted. He punched the glass in the window, and that's when everything broke. Glass shattered. The sound washed through the house. The man staggered, leaving shards and a trail that would later be described by police as a blood trail leading toward a nearby playground. Details like that land differently in a listener's mind. The glitter of glass, the drag of footsteps through snow or mud, the red that marks a crossing from reckless to criminal. Neighbors called the police. They took him from the house. They later followed the trail and found him at the playground. He was arrested. The family obtained a restraining order. The physical damage was repaired, the window replaced. But the mosaic of aftermath is never just glass and a legal document. It's the way memories of the house reorganized themselves, where the narrator hesitated to walk. Which rooms felt like their own? Which parts of the night played back in slow motion when they tried to sleep? There was an odd, lingering question that never quite closed. Were the earlier knocks related? Had the same person been testing doors for weeks before deciding to enter when the family was asleep? Or had someone else been pressing at the house while this man's arrival was coincidental? Some of the mystery remained unresolved, and that ambivalence settled into the family's daily life. The narrator's voice soft when they spoke about the aftermath. They described nights punctuated by the sound of cars that weren't theirs, the sudden twitch of awareness at the knock of a neighbor dropping by. The home, once a place of easy crossings and open doors, became measured territory. The Christmas memory retained both the absurdity of someone treating the living room as a lounge and the gravity of a stranger, crossing a line clear enough that the police could follow it to an arrest. These first two accounts share a pattern. A knock that was not frivolous, not accidental, but examined and used to test boundaries. The tactics changed slightly by geography and temperament. The delivery-masked man testing suburban back doors, the drunk intruder who wandered into a family's Christmas night, but the same thread runs through both stories. A question at the door, and a decision on the other side to press further. Between these stories, take a breath and picture something small and concrete. A peephole, a porch light, a patch of concrete at 8:45 p.m. Those images keep returning because they're simple and ordinary. The oddity is the repetition. The terror is in the pattern becoming a tool. The next story moves us across the country again to a quiet street in Springfield, Oregon. The voice here is younger, childlike in perception, acute in its ability to register the shape of fear. That child remembers the color of a rain jacket, the way a porch light threw long shadows when someone walked toward the drive. It was raining lightly that night, the kind of Pacific Northwest damp that makes colors bleed down. The family was on the porch, winding down, when the child saw the figure in the yellow rain jacket walking toward the driveway. The sight prompted a mother to usher the children inside, an instinctual move that felt at once protective and prescient. The front door shut. Curtains were drawn. The family should have been safe behind that thin barrier. But later, someone began banging at the front door. The knocking was aggressive, insistent enough to wake the house. The family tried the landline. No dial tone. Phones were dead. The man at the door whacked and yelled. His voice mingled with the rain. For a long time, they were trapped in the small island of their home, listening to the assault on the front entrance, powerless to call for help. He left that night. Weeks later, the house was entered through a different vulnerability, a cut in the window screen. Valuables were taken, small things that carry big weight for people. A vase that held cash, some jewelry, a few sentimental items. The method was quieter than a forced front door. The intruder had almost certainly watched and waited, had noted where windows were left at small angles for ventilation, had chosen an aperture that offered access without the clamor of breaking a lock. Police investigated. They never apprehended the person responsible. The family was left with a suspicion that the yellow rain jacket figure and the later break-in were connected. The child who remembered the jacket grew up with imprinting that a specific color could mean danger. The loss of the vase felt like a breach of a ritual, a private cache, exposed to the public. A detail like a missing mother appears later in this narrator's life. A fact that the storyteller folds into the narrative not as a cause, but as an element of changed family dynamics. The record is factual, sober, and it refrains from drawing line-by-line causality where none is proven. What remains obvious is the psychological aftermath. The family never quite relaxed back into ordinary evenings on the porch. They learned that a single night, a single rain-soaked silhouette, could alter the course of many small, habitual choices. These stories might feel disparate, different streets, varied actors, but their logic overlaps. A knock becomes a probe becomes an assessment becomes an opportunity. The threat rarely announces itself with fanfare. It approaches through routine, the familiar delivery man, the late-night wanderer, the shadow in the rain. That's why the smallest details, time of night, lack of a vehicle, a cut screen, matters so much in reconstructing what happened and why. We move now to a quieter, more isolated scene. This next account comes from Idaho, a missionary house, where two men lived in close quarters. The layout was compact, the rooms close enough that a noise in one window could be heard across the kitchen. Missionary life often means late nights and early mornings, a schedule that can make one less inclined to question a knock as much as someone working 9 to 5 might. But quiet does not equal safety, the way one hopes. The night in question was cold enough that snow had gathered in prints that would later play a crucial role in what the men found in the morning. It began with knocks, first at a porch door, then at a window, then again, the sound moving like someone walking around the house, tapping at panes and frames. The men went to the windows and saw nothing. Each time they checked, the knock had already shifted to another side of the house, a strategy that suggested deliberate movement rather than the stationary cadence of a prankster. At one point, only a single path of footprints appeared in the snow, a solitary trail that circled the house with the deliberate geometry of someone testing a perimeter. The landlord arrived at the property that night after receiving a call about a speeding pickup seen near the area. He found the pair waiting, tense and awake, watching the porch light for any sign of return. "We found prints that made a ring around the house," one of the missionaries said. "Not a trail going away. Just that loop." Footprints that don't lead away are the most unnerving. They suggest that the visitor was making a study, not fleeing. The landlord's arrival brought relief, but not answers. No confrontations occurred that night. No one forced a door or broke a window. Yet the men were left with the feeling of being surveyed, like property being measured. In the quiet hours that followed, their sleep broke into fragments. One of them admitted to waking at every whisper, checking locks the way a clock checks minutes. These accounts of urban rental, Christmas intrusion, Oregon porch, missionary house in Idaho are part of a pattern you begin to see when you listen closely. A knock used not as a plea, but as an instrument. The instrument varies with the operator posed as a delivery, cloaked in drunkenness, hidden under a raincoat, tentative in the snow, but the technique is the same. Small experiments. repetition, tests. At this halfway point in our telling, the tension is not simply in the moments of entry or the arrests, but in the adjustments people make afterward. They replace windows, obtain restraining orders, change how they answer a door, move to new houses. The consequences ripple outward into the day. Fear becomes practical, precaution becomes ritual. And yet, some threads are left unknotted. In several of these cases, questions remain. Were the knocks before the Christmas intrusion connected to the man who was found at the playground? Was the yellow rain jacket man ever definitively linked to the later break-in? Who circled the missionary house in the snow? The record gives us arrests in some places and open cases in others. We must honor that ambiguity. Sometimes the story reveals what it can and stops there. We are not here to sensation. We are here to lay out what happened, to show the pattern, to listen to the people who lived through those nights. There is a particular cruelty in being tested without knowing you were on a list, tested once in passing and then again, until a line is crossed. That cruelty is quiet. It is ordinary. It slips through the cracks of our daily confidence. I'll tell you one more thing, as we sit with these accounts. The sound of a knock at night is distinct from any other knock. It carries the weight of expectation. It is the kind of sound that sharpens hearing and memory. In these stories, survivors replay those knocks again and again, trying to locate the moment when a routine evening changed into an event with lasting consequences. We leave the next story at the threshold, the porch light still haloing, a figure in the rain jacket, the family clustered inside with their doors locked. The narrative continues, because there are more accounts to unfold, more patterns to mark, more ways these ordinary gestures knocks that repeat, knocks that circle have been weaponized into reconnaissance. The house is still standing. The knocks have not stopped. The people who answered them are living with the memory. There is a texture to this fear that isn't loud or cinematic. It is made up of small adjustments, curtains drawn a minute earlier, a predisposition to watch the driveway before stepping out, a tendency to meet every courier at the curb. Those are the measures that enter everyday life once a knock is recognized as more than a courtesy. As we pause here, take a breath and consider the common thread binding these stories. Someone on the other side of the door, treating your home like a test site. A knock becomes a probe. A probe becomes a plan. Sometimes the police intervene and arrests are made. Sometimes nothing conclusive follows. And sometimes the person inside thinks later about the near-misses, the nights they might not have been home, the doors they might have left unlocked, and the relief is tangled with guilt. There are still stories to tell. There are more voices, more small, precise details that build the pattern. But the one truth that emerges is simple and disquieting. A knock is not always merely a knock. It can be the first move in a sequence that strips away the ordinary and leaves behind unease that never fully settles down. They learned to live with small rituals that felt like armor. Some were sensible, double-checking locks, replacing old latches, keeping lights on timers. Others were quieter changes, habits that slid in without a clear moment of adoption. One narrator said, softly, I started answering the door with the phone in my hand, just in case. Another admitted to standing at the window and watching the street 5 minutes longer before stepping out to take the trash. These are not dramatic vows. They are subtle compulsions, born of a night that rearranged what ordinary felt like. The Springfield family remembered the yellow rain jacket in particular. The child's memory gave shape to a figure that otherwise might have been a blur. Years later, they could still recall the dull yellow sheen against the wet pavement. The way the jacket made the silhouette look almost cheerful even while it moved like a threat. The house where that child grew up kept a new set of rules. Curtains drawn earlier, a plan for where to meet if someone forced a door, and a lockbox for the items they considered most precious. They never suggested that any one measure would make them immune. They used the language of caution, not promises. The police report in that case showed a frustratingly familiar pattern. Officers noted the cut screen and the missing items. They took photographs, cataloged serial numbers, and canvassed neighbors. Tips came in. Sporadically, someone reported a similar theft in a neighboring street. Someone else mentioned a rain jacket sighting on a different night, but none of those threads reached a conclusive identity. The family was told what the evidence suggested: surveillance, observation, patience. But, for the people who had sat awake listening to the banging, the lack of closure became a part of the story itself. For the narrator working from home on that quiet dead-end street, the arrest of the man at another house offered a specific, awful proof. The police told them the arrested individual had described a method test in houses first. Hearing those words, the narrator said, "It made the nights that came before feel like a rehearsal I'd unknowingly watched." The arrests didn't undo the months of worry or the small invasions into daily life, but it did provide a legal knot to tie one end of the thread. That closure was partial and practical. Photographs of pry marks, a police statement, documentation for insurance. It also left unanswered the question that hovers in those cases: how many other houses had that man tested without leaving a trace? In Glasgow, even with an arrest, the question of connection remained. Were the earlier, quieter knocks leading up to Christmas part of the same sequence? The family speculated. The police had a suspect for the episode where the man was found passed out on the couch and later tracked to the playground. They secured a restraining order for safety. But whether those previous knocks were the same actor using the house as a test was not a certainty anyone could declare. The narrator said, "You never quite know what was a coincidence and what was a trail." That uncertainty became part of the house's memory, layered over photographs and toys and the ordinary clatter of daily life. Not all endings are tidy. In the missionary house in Idaho, the footprint loop was a record of someone who had paced and turned and paced again. It was choreography written in snow footprints, leading away. Only that ring. The landlord's arrival offered temporary relief. He parked, got out, walked the perimeter, and scanned with a flashlight while the men watched from a window. They felt observed even after the person left. That kind of presence leaves a residue. One missionary described wakefulness as the new normal. Even months later, a creak will make me stand up and check every door. You wait for something that never comes, and that waiting becomes part of your nights. Part of what makes these accounts so disquieting is the ordinariness of the initial gestures. Delivery drivers come to the door. People knock because they want a neighbor. Raincoats exist precisely so strangers can cross wet streets without soaking through. A knock at night is something most of us have heard and answered without fear. The common thread through these stories is how those ordinary signals were turned into reconnaissance. They were ways to measure insides from the outside. There were tangible financial consequences for some of the households. The broken window in Glasgow had to be replaced. The pry marks in the suburban house required carpentry. The vase in the Oregon home was not expensive, but the cash inside it vanished from a family's routine economy and from the private ritual of storing tithes or babysitting money. These are small losses that are easy to enumerate. They sit next to a harder ledger: the longer-term costs of sleep lost and the mental bandwidth consumed by looking over one's shoulder. Not every narrator wanted to dwell on policy or prevention. Many spoke about the emotional fallout, instead the way trust erodes. One homeowner described avoiding neighborhood gatherings for a while, embarrassed by the idea that their house had been watched. A mother recounted how she no longer left the back door unlocked for the dog. A teenager in Glasgow said friends noticed a change in her laughter. It had the edges of someone who'd counted the hours and recalculated safety. We must keep the narrative careful because the line between reasonable precaution and living in a constant state of fear is thin. No one in these accounts suggested that life should stop or that the world must be turned into a fortress. The shift was quieter. The small recalibrations of many evenings. In that sense, the violence was not only in the forceful moments when glass shattered, when a door was shoved, it was in the slow accumulation of interrupted nights and the patience of the visitors who came back again and again. There are also echoes of human kindness threaded through these stories. Neighbors who woke and called the police when something sounded off. Landlords who drove over at odd hours to check on tenants. Officers who stayed on the scene, photographing evidence and talking in the yard until dawn. In Glasgow, someone on a nearby street heard the commotion and cued the police to the trail that led to the playground. In Springfield, a neighbor put up extra lights after the break-in. Those small acts did not erase the harm, but they changed its shape. They made a community response visible, and in some cases that made the difference between a single, contained event, and a pattern becoming worse. Looking across the accounts, patterns emerge beyond the obvious. There is a recurrence of timing late evenings, when houses are quieter and occupants are less likely to step outside and confront a stranger. There is the absence of vehicles in some cases, the lack of a delivery truck, or the decision to approach on foot. There is the insistence of repetition knocks that return night after night. And there is the choice, too, of where to test: a back door, an unlocked window, a porch that is rarely used. The people who engaged in these acts, as the police described in one arrest, preferred to gather information before acting in full. That gathering of information is what makes these episodes particularly invasive. It is not the brazen snake, it is the patient measurement of a home's habits. Some narrators tried to measure their own responses in a language that made room for both fear and practical habit. "I don't want to be paranoid," one said, "but I won't be naive anymore." Another put it plainly, "It's a small thing, but now I always lock the back door before I turn on the oven. It's a tiny ritual that makes me feel, for the moment, like I've done something." Those rituals are the human answer to a problem that often feels bigger than any one person. How do you restore a feeling of safety in a place that has been observed? We cannot ignore the long tail of consequences. Years after the events, routines shift. Some people moved. Some stayed. One narrator moved houses months later because the sense of violation persisted in the beams and the floorboards, because every corner of that house had been, in their mind, inspected. Another family bought a small camera for the porch and developed a policy to always meet delivery drivers outside. The missionary house residents eventually left their posts for new assignments. They did not say their decision was purely because of the knocks, but the fatigue of sleepless nights weighed into their choices. There are moments when the facts are blunt and simple. Police arrived, photographs were taken, a man was arrested in one case. In other cases, nothing conclusive came of investigations. Tips that led nowhere, evidence that suggested but could not prove, questions that remained open. The narratives honored those ambiguities. When the speaker suspected a link between incidents, they said, "I suspect," or "I wondered." When the police believed something, the script noted, they suggested or reported. That language matters because it preserves both the experience of the victims and the integrity of what is actually known. It's worth pausing on what revealed means in the title. These stories reveal tactics. The Nokas test, the circling in snow, the cut screen, the pretend delivery. They reveal consequences. Broken glass, lost items, restraining orders, insomnia, and they reveal a human dynamic that is harder to measure: the erosion of ease. The quiet on the other side of the door when someone approaches. The revelation is factual and emotional at once. We lay out what happened and respect what cannot be fully explained. There were nights when the narrators replayed interactions in their head, small decisions that might have changed outcomes. Those counterfactuals are a natural part of trauma's anatomy. "What if I had answered?" one asked, not blaming, but cataloging possibilities. Another thought about surveillance, about the idea that a porch light can be read as an invitation. These hypothetical questions are a form of trying to make meaning out of randomness. They can be painful, and they can also be the first step toward constructing new ways of living that feel safer, even if imperfect. Responsibility in telling these stories means not turning them into moralizing lessons. They are not cautionary tales with tidy morals. They are testimonials about what people lived through and continue to carry. That is the obligation of the voice that compiles them: to present, not to preach; to honor, not to exploit. If there is a practical thread to draw, it is this: small details matter. The narrator, who kept a notebook of times and angles, provided investigators with a pattern that proved useful in later arrests. The neighbor who noticed a man pacing in the dark and called it in created a trail for police to follow. These are not formulas for safety, and they are not guarantees. They are reminders that perception, documentation, and community response can be part of a collective defense when strange things repeat. There is also a social element. People told their stories in ways that sought validation: neighbors who shrugged, officers who listened, family members who treated the events as unthinkable. The act of sharing matters. Several of the narrators said that telling the story later, to a friend or to the police, helped them to move out of solitude and into a place that felt a little less breached. Speaking becomes a way to reclaim experience from the weight of it. As we close these narratives, one final fact remains. Many of these incidents left no tidy ending. That is part of the truth. Some perpetrators were arrested, some were not. Some families patched windows and went on. Some changed homes. The memory of a knock at 8:45 p.m. The sight of a yellow rain jacket on a rainy night. The ring of footprints in undisturbed snow. These images persist. They persist because they are small, precise things that can be recalled and described. They persist because they remind us that the border between inside and outside is only as strong as the habits that guard it. If you've heard one of these knocks, or lived through something like this, you're not alone. Many who told their stories asked only that listeners take them seriously. They asked for attention to detail, for recognition that a knock can be a test and that repetition is rarely harmless. They did not ask for fear to be amplified but for understanding to be sharpened. So, what should we take away? Not a toolkit of guarantees, but a sober awareness that a knock at an odd hour should invite caution. That notes of pattern and witnesses can matter. That community response can make a difference. And above all, that those who experienced these nights did not invite the harm. They were witnesses to others' methods. Their accounts reveal tactics and consequences more than motives. Motives, when unknown, remain unknown. This has been a compilation of real encounters, real people, real nights, real aftermaths. We've shown what was revealed, the patterns, the arrests, in some cases, the unanswered questions, in others. We leave you with the textures of those nights, the smallness of a soft knock at 8:45 p.m., the dull shine of a yellow rain jacket in falling rain, the circle of footprints in snow that go nowhere. Those images are simple. They are also enough to change how a person moves through a house at night. If these stories resonated with you, or if you have an encounter you think should be heard, share it in the comments. Your voice could help someone recognize a pattern they've been trying to name. If you want more real, unsettling encounters like the ones we've just laid out, subscribe and join the conversation. Be careful out there, listen to the small things and remember that not every knock is only a knock. Frightening encounters reveal themselves in the tiny details.